All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee is still on vacation, but that doesn't mean, like I said before, that you guys aren't being able to learn a little bit. So we're picking up where we left off last class yesterday. Happy Friday, by the way. Hope you guys are enjoying your week so far. It's going to get a little bit better because we're going to learn about some more World War II history. So we're going to skip ahead a couple years here. We were talking about the U.S. getting into the war in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Operation Barbarossa, and Hitler invading the Soviet Union and how that went. And then we're jumping a little bit ahead here until 1944. So we're not going to necessarily stop and talk about all of the battles that happened in between that. We don't really have the time to go through all of that. Even though it is fascinating history, we're going to focus on one battle in particular, and this is the invasion or the battle that really kind of starts turning the war towards the Allies' favor, okay? There's a lot of really, really cool history written about this, okay? So, as I kind of talk about this stuff, I'll probably be mentioning some kind of other things, but, there's always definitely more to learn, more to go out there and read with different books and stuff. So I highly recommend if you guys really are interested in this stuff, then, definitely go out there and learn. If you want to ask Mr. Lee, I can definitely recommend some stuff. But for, the purpose of this class, we're going to keep it pretty basic. All right. So D-Day, Decision Day, that was just kind of the code name given to it, was really, really important. Okay. This was where you have Allied troops, largely American, are now going to land in France. Okay, remember, Nazi occupation took over the majority of France. Okay, and this is where these troops are going to help to try and liberate Western Europe, so France, Belgium, Netherlands, other countries from Nazi control. Okay, so this is why it's important. It's not just the fact that the U.S. is going to France, but that the U.S. is going to try and liberate these areas from the Nazi. This is really the beginning of the end of the Nazi regime in Germany. So as the lead up to the invasion starts, as you guys can imagine, huge amount of supplies, tanks, soldiers, ships, planes, hot air balloons, all this kind of stuff is needed. And so the Germans could tell because of the spies that the German had, because of the German reconnaissance, because of their intelligence gathering, they knew that there was an invasion that was going to happen from the Allies into Western Europe. They just didn't know exactly where. And so, and this is the part that I think is really interesting, there were spies on both sides that had infiltrated and gone behind enemy lines, and then some spies became double agents, okay? So, they were playing the sides off against each other. And so all these spies were engaged in this misinformation campaign and spreading around secrets and doing all these other things. And so even though that, the United States and the Allies were deliberately misleading the Germans and trying to say, hey, we're not really going to attack at Normandy. We're actually going to go at, Calais, which is the shortest point between England and France in the English Channel, or somewhere else. So they had all these different kind of things set up and all this stuff. And so it was really, really cool to see all the kind of like the behind the scenes stuff about how this would happen. To try to mislead the Germans. Okay. So for a lot of different reasons, which like I said, don't necessarily have all the time to get into in the world, the misinformation campaign was mostly successful. Okay. When 24,000 troops invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, the beaches were not deserted by any means, but it also did not have the largest concentration of German troops available. Okay. So there were German bunkers that were in the beach dunes. The shore was mined. They were covered with wooden stakes and barbed wire and metal tripods to try and make it difficult to get through. So that way you couldn't just drive, tanks up on the beach. You had to have soldiers come out of the water and go up there. And there was about a 50-mile stretch of beach in Normandy that was divided into 5 sections. You had Utah Beach, Omaha, Juno, Gold, and Sword. Okay, and so the invasion happened at different points. Different beaches had heavier fighting than the other. Omaha Beach is infamous for having some of the heaviest fighting in World War II in general in terms of all this. So remember, it's a 50-mile stretch. So it's a very, very, very wide stretch of beach. So that happened on June 6, 1944. And then by June 12th, 6 days later, all 5 sections of the beaches were connected. Okay, so it took about 6 days for the Americans to really gain a foothold here. If you guys have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, kind of the big opening scene, and that is the storming of the Normandy beach, and that is a very, supposedly very, very successful recreation of what happened there. So very, very bloody, very, very violent, very, very hard and difficult. Where to take a strongly held higher ground position, but the Allies were able to do it. Around 4,000 Allied deaths occurred during these 6 days. Sometimes it's hard to tell because exactly what happened. Some stories have estimated a little bit higher, all the way up to almost 10,000 deaths, but definitely 4,000 or a little bit over 4,000 were confirmed. And then there were about 4,000 to 9,000 German deaths. So, a large period of fighting, or sorry, not a large period of fighting, but a large amount of deaths in a short period of fighting. Okay, so very, very bloody battles. All right, and so once the Allies are able to successfully get Normandy, okay, and then this is just a picture of the invasion force, so you guys can see. It wasn't just a couple of ships or anything coming in, and this is just a 5-mile stretch of beach or something like that. So not the whole lot, but you can see all the ships, all the Zeppelins, all the planning and supplies that it took in order to get the Allies into Normandy. And so because of this, now that they have this foothold, they're going to send over tons of supplies, tons of troops, tons of ships, and they're going to use this as kind of a launching point to really start pushing the Nazis back in Western Europe, trying to push them back towards Berlin. Okay. After this, at the same time that this is happening to go back to the previous slide for a second, the same time that this is happening in Western Europe, the Soviets are also starting to push back in Eastern Europe and liberate some of that from Nazi control. Remember, after Operation Barbarossa in 1942, the non-aggression pact that Stalin and Hitler had is no longer valid. Okay, so once Hitler invades the Soviet Union, Stalin said the gloves are off. We're going at you guys full force. A lot of fighting, very, very heavy fighting between the Soviets and the Germans for a long time, but then the Soviets start to gain a foothold and start pushing the Germans back. So now the Germans are getting pushed back into Germany on both the Eastern Front and the Western Front. All right. So after the invasion of D-Day in France, 1944, by winter of 1944 into winter of 1945, the writing was kind of on the wall that Germany was going to lose. The Allies were really beginning to realize that this was going to come to an end sooner rather than later, and that Germany was losing the war. Italy had become kind of a non-issue. We don't have time to talk about the North African campaigns and other things like that. But Italy was really struggling as well. So of the 3 Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, the 2 European ones were really starting to crumble and fall apart. So they knew that victory in Europe was coming soon. So in February of 1945, they had what was known as the Yalta Conference. Right? So that's where you had the leaders of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union come together. They decide what to do with Germany after the war. So almost kind of like a pre-treaty meeting. So you have Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, obviously, and then Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. And they decided that because they had the Treaty of Versailles, because that that was, even though that was seen as harsh on Germany, but they tried to give Germany a chance, and that Germany didn't live up to what it was supposed to be doing. So they said, okay, we're going to be really, really harsh on Germany now, and they're going to divide Germany up into 4 zones that are going to be controlled by other countries. Say that Germany, they can't handle being on their own is basically what they said. Germany's got to move back in with their parents, for lack of a better word, to kind of put it into perspective for you guys. One of these zones is going to be controlled by England, one by the United States, one by the Soviet Union, and then one by France. Okay, because France and Germany have been historical enemies, and France wanted some retribution after the damage done both from World War I and World War II. Okay. Stalin also agreed, because remember that Stalin invaded parts of Poland in agreement with Hitler, that he would allow free elections to occur in Poland so they could elect the government or the type of leaders that they wanted to. And then Stalin also agreed to enter the fight against Japan and help the United States out there once victory in Europe was assured. Then the last thing that they decided is that the Nazi war criminals would go on trial. You guys are going to learn some more about the Holocaust and some of the horrors that happened there in terms of the experiments done, in terms of the brutal death rates that they had, the brutal treatments of prisoners, and all this really, really shameful stuff that happened under the Germans' rule. And so they decided that the Nazi war criminals would go on trial, that they did need to have a trial, that they couldn't just administer street justice and kill the Nazi officers on the spot once they were captured. They said that they would go on trial, and that would occur with the Nuremberg trials after the end of the war. So of all the Nuremberg trials, just to kind of jump forward a little bit, after the war has ended, only about 11 Nazi officials were found guilty of war crimes, kind of like some of the top people. Obviously not all of the top people, which you guys are going to hear about here in a second why. But only about 11 were charged and found guilty of committing crimes against humanity, and they were executed shortly after. But hundreds of thousands of Nazi soldiers and ranking officers and scientists were, for lack of a better word, not charged with crimes, even though they were complicit in what they were doing. And, that's going to always be the big question in history, is that whenever you have these horrible types of things happening, is, how much is each individual person guilty? At what point does it stop being, oh, okay, I was just following orders? What point does the person have to say, okay, this is wrong? Or even if they believe is right, are they guilty, or should they be blamed for it? All this kind of stuff gets kind of wrote in. And then to kind of add insult to injury in terms of this, at the end of the war, the United States engaged in what was known as Operation Paperclip, which is where, in order to help win the Cold War race against the Soviets, which we'll learn more about next week, that the U.S. basically, for lack of a better word, smuggled in hundreds of former Nazi scientists, gave them new identities, new names, and had them assimilated into the United States. Okay, so very interesting learning about that kind of stuff. But like I said, we're getting a little bit off topic here, so let me go back. So at the Yalta Conference, February 1945, they decided how to break up Germany after the end of the war. However, a couple months later, in April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. Okay, so he knew that even though he had just been elected to a record-breaking fourth term, that his health was failing him. He realized he probably wasn't going to be able to survive the whole term. And his main goal was trying to get to the end of the war, and then he would retire from the presidency, let his vice president take over. But he wasn't able to do that. He died before the war was over, but not by much. He only missed it by about a little bit less than a month. So Harry Truman, who is the vice president, now becomes president. Okay. And so obviously that's going to be a big decision-making process, and Truman's going to have a lot of decisions to be made about how the war is going to take place in the Pacific Ocean and the fight against Japan. But the war in Europe is basically over by the time Harry Truman becomes president on April 12th in 1945. As Truman is getting sworn into office, Allied troops are closing in around Germany. They're starting to go invade Germany. They're getting pushed. Hitler's troops are getting pushed in, and they're getting closer to the German capital of Berlin. And so you have allies coming in on both sides. You have the French and the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians coming in from the Western Front, and then the Soviets coming in the Eastern Front. And that's basically they're both racing towards Berlin. They both really, really wanted to be the ones that would be able to capture Berlin, kind of gain that credit for getting the official capture of Berlin and officially ending the war. So as the war is really winding down in Europe. In late April, April 29th, Hitler is informed that Benito Mussolini, as I said, was captured and shot to death and hung up basically in the streets and kind of made to be seen as a mocking, a kind of a public figure, even though he had this long dictatorial reign. That the freedom fighters who captured Mussolini and shot him really wanted to kind of degrade his corpse and show that, even though Mussolini thought a lot of himself, that he wasn't really that big a deal. So some historians have said that this made Hitler really determined that he did not want to be caught. He did not want to have that type of thing happen to him. He didn't want to be, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Seen as, as a degrading public figure. He was very much an egotist. He thought himself as kind of larger than life, and he wanted to be remembered that way. So on April 30th, Hitler and his longtime companion, Eva Braun, they are underneath the Nazi capital in Berlin, the Nazi Capitol building, and they decide to take a cyanide capsule as the Soviet troops are closing into Berlin. The next day, Hitler's second in command, him and his wife, they also take a cyanide capsule, and then they also killed all their children. Okay, so that the two highest-ranking Nazi officials basically committed suicide as the Soviet troops were closing in around their location. They did not want to be caught. They did not want to be charged with their crimes. They didn't want any of that kind of stuff to happen. The Germans who were still there guarding the area around them burned Hitler and his companions' bodies and then buried them. When the Soviet troops, because the Soviets were the first to arrive them, they also found the graves, dug up the corpses, and then burned them again, and then buried them again. Okay? And why did they do this the way exactly was done? There's a lot of, disinformation going back and forth about what the Soviets' kind of goal that they wanted to accomplish was. But it's believed by a general amount of historians that the main purpose of that was to try and instill, a sense of fear or uncertainty among the Americans, because even though they were still technically allies at this point, Soviet and American tension was already on the rise. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about were only released records of after the Soviet Union fell in 1991. And people have just found out in the last 10 to 15 years as that they go in and find these records about what, quote unquote, really happened as the Soviets closed in on Berlin. And so this led to a lot of rumors about Hitler being, alive after the end of the war, particularly in Argentina was kind of the big one. But recent DNA tests has been done in the last couple of years where they finally were able to discover the bones, and it was confirmed that Hitler did commit suicide in 1945. Part of the reason that some of those rumors came up is that a lot of Nazi officials did flee Germany and go to Argentina, and so lots of Nazi gold was discovered there, lots of Nazi paraphernalia. The Argentinian government accepted the Nazis as kind of, for lack of a better word, with open arms. They didn't charge them with criminal trespassing or anything like that. They gave them fake passports and allowed them to come into their country as well. So all those secret things kind of led to a lot of rise in stories about Hitler possibly being alive, but it's confirmed that he was, in fact, dead in 1945. So now we have VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. What's left of the German army officially surrenders. The war is over in Europe, so obviously a very, very exciting time. May 8th is still celebrated in Europe for a large part in terms of the end of the war. But for the United States and the other allies, but particularly the United States, now the war turns to the Pacific, okay, and the fight against Japan. And how are we going to end the war with Japan? The war in Europe is over, but we are still fighting in the Pacific Ocean. So one of the big strategies in order to get to the island of Japan. So remember what we talked about, we look at our map, Japan's all the way up here, okay? But they had expanded their power island to where you see all this yellow. And so the U.S. could not just get, we didn't have the technology at the time to have planes that could go from the U.S. Navy bases in Guam and Hawaii and Pearl Harbor to go all the way to Japan. So we had to know so they came up with the strategy was known as island hopping. Okay, where if you follow the green arrows, they get closer and closer to Japan by getting on one island and then the next and the next and the next and the next and keep going and working our way close enough to Japan where that if it was needed to invade Japan, we would be able to do that because at the time, with Japan controlling all those islands, we wouldn't be able to get close to mainland Japan. A lot of these island battles that we were on were very, very fierce, very, very tough fighting for reasons that we're going to talk about in a second. And the main one that we're going to talk about is the Battle of Iwo Jima. It was a strategically important island in order to bomb Japan. It's a very, very small island. If you can see it kind of with our map in the right-hand corner there. But this is one of the first, I guess you could say, major islands that the U.S. is able to capture in their quest for getting closer to Japan. It had some of the fiercest and bloodiest fighting in the entire war. The Japanese bunkers that they retreated into on a raised position, which you guys know anything about military tactics, so that if you have the high ground and bunkers, it's almost impossible to get you out. The Japanese also had an underground network of tunnels to go in between the bunkers, so they didn't have to leave them in order to change positions or to go to different sides of the hill or to, trade supplies with one another. So they were very, very hard to get out and this was about a month-long battle. Of all the U.S. soldiers that were killed were about just under 7,000 U.S. soldiers killed, and about 20,000 were wounded. Okay, so that is a huge, huge amount of numbers in terms of the length of it. Only about a month, but over 6,000 killed. So we're talking hundreds a day. Japanese fatalities, about 17 to 18,000 dead or missing. Okay, so in terms of the overall numbers, Japanese had 17 to 18,000 dead, wounded, or missing. U.S. had about 28,000 wounded, missing, or killed. Okay, so this is the only Marine battle that American casualties were actually greater than Japanese casualties, and the reason is because it was so hard to try and get to that fortified position at the top of the mountain of Iwo Jima. Because of the underground network of tunnels, some Japanese holdouts were still fighting even after the Americans, quote unquote, took control of it. And some of the holdouts lasted actually for a long time. And it wasn't until January of 1949. So 4 years after the battle, quote unquote, officially ended, the last holdout, the last Japanese person surrendered. So they kept fighting for 4 years, which if you really think about it is crazy. So even after the Japanese government surrendered, they kept on fighting. And so it gives you kind of the mindset about the Japanese and, their mentality of not giving up. But very, very tough battles, and a lot of battles in the Pacific on these islands are very much like this. Iwo Jima is just a little bit more of the famous ones, partly because of the high number of casualties, and also because of this very famous picture that's in the top right-hand corner here of the Marines that were raising the flag at the top of Iwo Jima Hill. You see it a lot of times in anything talking about World War II, or a lot of talking about soldiers sacrificing and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of seen as an exemplar photo of American history and especially the American military. And so it's the guys who have raised the flag have also become kind of like celebrity and cult status. But actually, kind of interesting if you guys have ever seen the movie or read the book Flags of Our Fathers, that it's actually been very hard to identify who exactly were these men that raised the flag, and should they be getting all this success and popularity that they did. But that's a different story. If you really want to learn more about that, read the book Flags of Our Fathers. Very, very good. And so as we're getting closer and closer to Japan, we have to backtrack a little bit here, okay? Because as you guys know, to end the war with Japan, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the nation of Japan. So as we're getting closer and closer to Japan, the Japanese are still not surrendering. It was not in the Japanese mindset to surrender. They very much, as you can see by the holdouts on Iwo Jima Island, that's just one example of it, but it was not in their nature to surrender. Okay, despite, they didn't care how many casualties that they were going to give up. They didn't care about how many, lives would be lost by the soldiers or their civilians. They said, we have to keep on fighting till the end. We do not surrender. That's just not what we do. Okay. So with that in mind, backtracking a little bit. Okay. In the 1930s, in Europe, the scientists discovered nuclear fission, which is where you split atoms. And so the theoretic idea of an atomic bomb was possible. Okay. And I'm not going to get too much in the science part because I don't think you guys would care too much, but also because I don't necessarily understand it myself. But because when you split an atom, something on that atomic process, it creates a huge, 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 very, very, very powerful explosion. Okay. And that's all they knew. They didn't know about the radiation at the time. They didn't know about the, the damaging after effects in terms of cancer and things like that. They just knew it was going to be a big, big explosion. All right. So in October 1941, Franklin Roosevelt approves the creation of the atomic program. Okay. Very, very top secret program. Obviously, didn't want a lot of people knowing about it. They didn't want other countries, particularly the Nazis, finding out about it. They didn't want other countries that were their allies finding out about it. So very, very few people knew about it. Okay. Even President Truman wasn't necessarily in the know about the atomic bomb as it was happening. So the code name for the atomic bomb project is ended up known as the Manhattan Project. Okay, so when you ever hear about the Manhattan Project, they're talking about building the bomb. Los Alamos, New Mexico was the main base where they decided to have the first tests. And so once they discovered that they could have the test and they could successfully detonate the atomic bomb, as I said, they didn't understand the radiation or they didn't know about the radiation, that after effects, they just knew it was going to be a big-ass explosion. So as the war has ended in Europe on May 8th, the U.S. is island hopping towards Japan. It's becoming apparent that the U.S. is probably going to win the war with Japan. The only question is how many lives are going to be lost. If the U.S. has to go ahead and invade the island of Japan, how many soldiers are going to be lost? Is there another way to go about doing this? Is there a better way? There's no good way to go about doing this, but is there a better way? Okay. And so a lot of historians have kind of argued back and forth about, should the U.S. have done it? And I think, in morally, that's a decision that's up to each individual person. I think my job as a history teacher is to try and get you guys to explain why Truman said that he was going to go ahead and do it, why he made the decision. Whether or not he made the right decision, I think that's your own individual opinion to make. Okay? So Truman decides to drop the atomic bomb on Japan basically to end the war quicker and to save, he says it will save American soldiers' lives. Okay. Japan refused to unconditionally surrender to the U.S. They wanted to keep fighting, or keep fighting, but still have control of their army in China, still have control over island nations that they conquered by military force. And so the U.S. did not want to allow Japan to do that. They said, hey, no, if we're doing this stuff, we're going to do it all the way. You need to go back to where you have no, what's the word I'm looking for here? No military possessions, no conquered countries. You have to relinquish control over them. And you also have to remember that the U.S. had not, at this time, had already started to been bombing Japan with fire bombs and napalm and other bombs. And in particular, the firebombing of Tokyo by the U.S. had killed over 150,000 Japanese, and the Japanese had still not surrendered. Okay, so Truman knew that this was not, they needed kind of an extraordinary weapon or an extraordinary scenario in order to try to get the Japanese to surrender. And so that was kind of the main idea, that he thought that this could be that, their quote unquote secret weapon, that he was going to be able to do that. The U.S. military estimated that a land slash sea invasion of Japan could take years and result in over 1 million casualties for the Allies, for the Americans. Okay, Japan is very, very mountainous territory. If you talk about the island nations, or sorry, not the island nations, but just the islands that Japan controlled, in those very, very tiny square mile areas of just maybe 4 or 5 square miles, we're talking about thousands of deaths for the U.S. and even more for Japanese. So take that and multiply it by 1,000 or 10,000 for the size of Japan. And I mean, like the U.S. military said, it could take years, millions of casualties for the Allies, and who knows about how many Japanese death it would end up taking. Okay. The U.S. possibly was also possibly. This is one of those ones where historians can kind of go back and you can say, oh well, it might have been this, but you never know for sure. They might have been also worried about the Soviets coming in and invading Japan as well and getting the credit for that. And so while that might not seem like that big a deal in terms of international relations, as I stated before, even though the U.S. and the Soviet Union were technically allies, there was already a lot of rising tensions between the two countries, and which is going to bleed right into the Cold War after the end of World War II. So still, the tension with the Soviets is already starting to grow. And so for the main reason to try and save American lives, Truman does decide to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. So here's a kind of pictures of the two bombs that are dropped. We have Fat Man and Little Boy, just to give you guys kind of an idea of the size of these bombs. Fat Man, so the one on the left there, was about a little over 10,000 pounds. It was about 10 feet tall and 5 feet around. Little Boy on the right there was about 9,000 pounds, and it was 10 feet long and about 2 foot around. So two completely different size-shaped bombs. I have no idea why they were shaped the way they did, why they were different. I guess that's just the way they were built. I'm not sure if one was built to be more destructive than the other. I'm not really sure, to be honest. And so the U.S. drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima first, okay, on August 6th, asks Japanese to surrender pretty much within hours after the bomb was dropped. The Japanese government refuses. 3 days later, the United States drops an atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, okay, and that's when Fat Man was dropped. And then 6 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan agrees to unconditionally surrender to the U.S. So just to give you guys some statistics, as you can see on the screen, with Hiroshima kills about 80,000 to 100,000 or 110,000 people instantly. Nagasaki, 25,000 to about 54,000 people instantly. Okay. The reason that I put instantly in there is that, as you guys can see on the picture here, when you have an atomic explosion, it is a very, very hot, very, very devastatingly destructive explosion. It's different than a normal quote unquote bomb. Is that people just don't get hit by shrapnel. Is that the heat is so hot that it will actually vaporize you. So there's no skeletons left. There's no corpses left of these people. Only on the people who are on the very, very outer edges of the blast would have these kind of effects that you would think of with a regular quote unquote bomb. But the people who are very, very close to where the bomb exploded in the center, basically instantly vaporized. So the instant count is in there because that's a little bit easier to figure out. The long-term count in terms of radiation poisoning, radiation sickness, that's a little bit harder to exactly determine, and how that plays out. Partly because some of that data wasn't tracked at the time because they didn't know about it. Partly because that, if someone gets cancer, it's exactly because of the nuclear bomb. It's just some of those things very, very hard to know for sure exactly what happened. But here's just kind of a little bit of picture of Nagasaki before and after. So if you see right here, the bottom, that's ground zero. So if you're kind of looking at the comparison of the river then right about here. So talk in terms of devastation. I mean, it wipes out buildings. Every single building is just gone. All right. So very, very, very devastating bombs. And like I said, they weren't just like, exploded and, burned to the ground. They were, vaporized. Like buildings were vaporized. They just disappeared because of the heat of the explosion. All that's left was like ash. Okay. So very kind of hard for us to comprehend. Some of revisionists or armchair historians, basically amateur historians, people who are just interested in history, some have said that I think hindsight's always 2020. That the use of the atomic bombs was immoral. That the U.S. could have been charged with war crimes for doing that. I think I think that's a little bit harsh of them to say. I think that you have to really understand the mindset and the positions of the time. And like I said, maybe that's a decision you guys are going to be making, you can make for your own selves about whether or not the U.S. should or should not have done that. But like I said, I think my job is to not necessarily tell you guys what to think, but to tell you why leaders made the decisions that they did and so we go back to Truman talking about what he thought would have saved millions of casualties for the Allies and possibly even more for the Japanese if there was a land invasion to happen. So with the surrendering of Japan, the war is officially over in the Pacific. World War II is over in 1945 with the Japanese surrender just a couple months after the German surrender in Europe. And so the U.S. and the world is now forever changed because of World War II. A lot of what the U.S. foreign policy position, how we interact with the rest of the world is based off of World War II. In terms of military technology, you had not only the atomic bomb, but also other new technologies that were developed during the time. But particularly the nuclear bomb is really going to change how the world is for the next, basically 45 years in terms of the U.S. and Soviet Union once they get into the Cold War. But we're going to learn more about that later in classes. So that kind of wraps up the war itself in terms of battles. Next week, we're going to discuss a little bit more about how the war affected the U.S. at home and some of the other things. We're going to touch on the Holocaust and spend some time learning about that stuff. But if you guys want to know more about this, there's plenty of good websites or good books that you guys can look at to learn more. I think this stuff is fascinating. I just want to try to keep it a little bit condensed for you guys. But if you do want to learn more, please shoot me a message or shoot me an email, and I can point you guys in the right direction. Okay. I hope you guys have a great weekend. Don't forget to take the quiz in Schoology on this, and then you guys will actually be seeing me on Monday. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Go ahead and take that quiz. And like I said, have a great weekend.